Well, good morning or good afternoon. My name is Gene Rice. I'm an associate professor of philosophy at Fort Hays State University, and this lecture is being recorded for Philosophy 201, Introduction to Political Philosophy, and that is also the topic of the day, Introduction to Political Philosophy. You have already by now watched and discussed a couple of items related to ethics, Introduction to Ethics, and also an introduction to philosophy. So we're going to continue today, and this will probably be the last or one of the last introductory lectures. That is, lectures just giving you the lay of the land and giving you a chance to think about what it is you're going to be doing before you actually begin doing it this semester. So because, again, this is an introductory course, and because for most of you this is your first time taking a philosophy course, we're trying to take baby steps, or to go fairly slow, and to give you a chance to think about it. And then, of course, in class and in your small groups and so forth, you'll be doing and thinking a little bit more about this with your fellow classmates. So let's begin. And let's begin with a little bit of review. In previous lectures, we talked about three general areas of philosophical thinking or philosophical inquiry. The first is what is known as metaphysics, and in metaphysics we look at questions about ultimate reality and what counts as being ultimately real. In epistemology, we look at questions of knowledge. How do we know, or how do we prove that we know something? And lastly is what is called value theory. And value theory, again, as you may recall, is the study of value and its nature. And within the category of value theory, we identified a couple of different areas. These are not necessarily mutually exclusive, but aesthetics was the study of artistic value and beauty, and moral and ethical philosophy talks about the study of human conduct, in particular the prescriptive study of human conduct. And then lastly, there you see social and political philosophy, which will be our topic for today. So that was just to orient you into the different areas of philosophy. And let's do one more bit of review. And the one more bit of review I would like to do today has to do with the difference between prescriptive and descriptive ethics. So if you recall, under the heading of ethics as the study of human conduct, we had an important primary distinction between doing ethics in a philosophical manner and doing it in a descriptive or scientific manner. And descriptive ethics involves the scientific investigation of our ethical behaviors and involves sociology, anthropology, and so forth. And philosophical ethics is the more open-ended inquiry into the oughts and the shoulds, that is, evaluating what it is that we should be doing, not necessarily what it is we currently believe or what people currently practice in ethical terms, but what they should be doing. So, that having been said, underneath the description of philosophical ethics, then we had a further breakdown between substantive ethics and meta-ethics. And underneath substantive ethics, then, is the search for foundational principles of right and wrong, or goodness and badness. Under that heading, we will have political philosophy. So, let us take a look at a preliminary definition of political philosophy, and let us look also at some common philosophical political philosophy questions, and also some important figures that you will probably be studying, at least some of them, over the course of the next few weeks and months. All right, political philosophy. Political philosophy is the branch of substantive ethics, that is philosophical ethics, that investigates first the proper moral relationship of individuals to society. So when we talk about political philosophy, we're talking about the relationship between individuals to groups. And the number and the form of those groups will obviously vary. The group could be your family, it could be your local community, or it could be your nation, or even indeed the entire world. Human beings are by nature social animals. That is to say, no human being comes into the world as an individual who can survive without the help of others. So it takes anywhere from 15 to 30 years for a human being to grow and to develop into a full adult human being. And even then, after we become individuals, fully fledged adult humans, we do not separate ourselves, at least almost no one separates themselves totally from the influences of others. In fact, that's a very hard thing to do. So in political philosophy, we're looking at the relationship of individuals to groups, to society. We're looking at both our rights and our duties. And so when you think about your relationship to other groups, you can think about both your rights, that is the elements which you have power over, the obligations which others have to you, but also your duties, that is the elements which you are responsible to fulfill yourself. So you have some liberties, some control over certain situations, but also you have some obligations. So, for example, I'm a father, and as a father, I have the right to discipline my children within certain limits, but I also have the obligation or the responsibility to discipline them. So I have the right to take them on vacation, but I have the obligation to keep them safe as we travel. So when we think about political philosophy and the relationship between individuals and society, we must think about both of those elements. All right, let's look at the second portion of our definition. The second portion says that the study of political philosophy is the study of the ethical nature of coercive institutions and the acceptable limitations on their power. So when we think about political philosophy, we're thinking about, in large part, about coercive institutions. And to coerce someone is to try to get them to do something that you want. And so coercive institutions, you might think firstly of government, and that's certainly true, but large groups can be coercive, and so can families. Obviously, in all three of those cases, the institutions wield some kind of power. And so in political philosophy, we're looking to identify what is an acceptable use of coercive power. Can the government force you to wear seat belts or prevent you from using a drug, a certain kind of drug? In the family setting, what limits should we set on parents raising their children? Should we allow them to raise their children and educate them at home? Or is that not acceptable way to bring up or to educate your child? And we already talked briefly about discipline. Are there limits on the ways that families, parents can discipline their children? And so, of course, these forms of punishment, discipline in the family or punishment at the level of nation states, is a way of coercing people, of getting them to do what you want. And so political philosophy studies that dynamic and asks the question not just what kinds of current coercion are acceptable, but what should be acceptable. So for example, in the United States, we have an ongoing debate about capital punishment. Is the state justified in, is it morally acceptable for the state to execute some people for certain crimes, or is that an abuse of the power of the state? Okay, let's look at the third then and last element of our definition of political philosophy. And this is just really not so much part of the definition as to point out to you that the increased technological power of human society and also our increasing globalization mean that we can affect others much more than in the past. We have it within our power, or at least humanity as a whole has it within their power to literally obliterate the world with nuclear weapons. As we can see in some of our environmental crises, we have it within our power to ruin the air and ruin the water around us. And we also, of course, have the ability to ruin the air and the water for people far, far away from our own particular geographic location. So I think these are important considerations as we think about why we ought to study political philosophy. And certainly I think, I hope you find that your study of political philosophy this semester, and particularly the political philosophy of the West, will give you some insights not only into why we have done what we're doing now, but where we ought to go on some of these important questions. All right, let's look a little bit further then at our chart. Remember, in previous sessions we had identified a number of distinctions within the study of ethics. And so if I were going to locate political philosophy, I think it would be at least one appropriate way to locate it would be to put it there under substantive ethics and alongside ethical philosophy and applied ethics. So this is not a sacred way of organizing political philosophy in relationship to the other studies under ethics, but it's one thing, and it may be helpful for you. If it is, feel free to use it. If not, that's all right. Let's look at some examples of great political philosophy questions. Oh, I got bored of not having pictures on there, so I threw that revolution picture up there, but that doesn't really mean anything. Some examples of great political philosophy questions. Are some forms of government better than others? Is a monarchy worse than a democracy? Is a communist country better than a socialist country? Is a socialist country better than a democracy? Number 2, does might or power make right? Number 3, what is justice? You'll hear claims of justice and injustice all the time in the Western media, and the question immediately arises, what is justice? Is there a value of justice? How do we debate between competing claims of justice? Number 4, can people morally overthrow their government? Is revolution acceptable, and under what limits? Number 5, what limits, if any, are there in a parent raising a child? So we've already talked about this a couple of times here this morning. And 6, are there any universal human rights? Human rights today, I think, are the default language of political discourse. And what I mean by that is you can't listen to or participate or watch a political debate in this country or in most international debates without hearing the word human right or basic right. And so the language of human rights has become extremely important over the last 50, 60, 70 years. And yet in the whole span of political philosophy, the concept of a human right is a relatively recent development. And so in this course, you are likely to hear people talk about rights, to refer to human rights. And as I said, if you watch any political discourse, you'll definitely come across that word. And so in a political philosophy class, it's entirely appropriate that we spend some time talking about what is a human right. Are they really universal? That is, do they apply to all people at all times and places? Or are they something the West, the powerful countries of America and Great Britain and other Western countries, is it something we came up with to try and force our culture on other non-Western countries? Are there different kinds of rights? Are there social rights as opposed to property rights? Are property rights more important than social rights if we would want to make that kind of a decision? And lastly, are certain groups protected by special rights? Are there really such things as women's rights, the rights of homosexuals, the rights of indigenous groups of people, or are those misleading sorts of distinctions that we ought to steer clear of? So all those kinds of questions are really questions for political philosophy. Again, not merely describing or just describing how people use the word human rights, but investigating and arguing for and against these various conceptions of human rights. All right, let's briefly look at a list of great political philosophers. Again, I threw this list together a little bit haphazardly, and so there's nothing sacred about this list on either side, but that picture in the middle there is a rendition of Plato and Aristotle, famous teacher and student walking along, and they are among the most important ancient political philosophers that we know. Hobbes and Locke and Rousseau are philosophers in what is called the early modern period, very important, as are Bentham and Mill. And Karl Marx, of course, famous for his work on socialism and communism. And then John Rawls is really the only contemporary philosopher I have listed there, although we will probably read, you will probably read, and we will probably discuss over the course of the semester other contemporary philosophers. John Rawls just passed away a few years ago, but his thinking continues to be extremely important. On the non-Western side, again, this list is fairly arbitrary. Confucius, of course, great Chinese and Asian thinker. Mengzi, Mao Tzu, and Lao Tzu, again, ancient or certainly Chinese philosophers in periods long, long ago. You also have, of course, great Islamic and Arabian thinkers like Muhammad, Avicenna, and Averroes, and I threw Gandhi in there at the end for obvious reasons. All right. Last, in one of the previous introductory lectures on ethics, I ended with a little description of what ethics was not. In other words, what are some of the disciplines or areas of inquiry in which we might be tempted to confuse ethical philosophy? And I want to do the same thing for political philosophy. And so let's take a brief look at what political philosophy is not. Because this is a philosophy class, as we have already mentioned, we're interested in those prescriptive questions, not just the descriptive questions. And so in this class, you will be entertaining questions that are, at least in many cases, a little different than those of political science, political management, or international law. Political science is usually understood as a type of social science, and as such, it is a descriptive science. And its chief aim is to explain political institutions or to explain the often very complicated processes which make up political institutions. And so political science is one of the great social sciences out there, but it is not exactly the same as political science, it's not exactly the same as political philosophy. Nor is this class a management kind of a class. Political management, again, a wonderful discipline, is usually understood as a form of applied political science, and it is concerned with campaign management or other elements of professional, what you might call professional politics. That is, people who are involved in getting elected, in changing laws, in leading their local governments, and so forth. So we are not doing political science, and we're not doing political management. Again, not because it's not a good discipline, but because it's not the course that you're taking here from us here at Fort Hays at this time. And lastly, we talked about this a little bit again in the ethics section. We are not doing primarily positive law or international law. Positive law, if you recall, was the discussion of the current laws of the land, and we are not we're not going to be tied to those discussions. Often, of course, it will be important that you know what the laws are at a particular time, but in this class we'll be most interested in identifying why we ought to believe that those laws are good or bad. And the same goes for international law. International law is over the last 100 years has emerged as a very important consideration for political philosophy. Another potential war criminal was just arraigned here very recently, and so we're starting to see international law become a real force within political philosophy across nations, across geographic boundaries. And so while international law is very important, we will want to ask the questions, is it justified? Where does the International Criminal Court, for example, where does it get its moral justification, if at all? What kinds of punishment are allowable under international law standards? And so since World War II, really, we've seen a flourishing of different kinds of international law, some under the guise of the United Nations, and some international law created by regional or by other kinds of political bodies. And so we'll spend some time talking about those things, but again, our interest primarily is in whether they're morally justified, what limits, if any, would we set on their power, and so forth. So that is our introduction to political philosophy, a very brief one, and you'll also, of course, have read the Introduction to Political Philosophy from your book, and we'll have some exercises and some small group discussions for you to continue thinking about these topics. So until next time, this has been Gene Rice in the fine studio in the basement of Fort Hays State University's Forsyth Library, signing off.